introduce systems. Systems. Okay, let's introduce systems. All right. So we've been talking about cells, right? We talked about cells and we talked about specialized cells. So if we recall, an embryo starts off as one cell. The cell starts to divide. Then you get specialized cells eventually start to form, right? Some cells stay as stem cells, but you get lots of specialized cells. Now, those specialized cells are going to form tissues, which are going to form organs, which are going to form systems. So I think out of all these terms that are on my screen, probably the one that we're least familiar with would be this one. Because we've talked about cells, we've talked about specialized cells. I'm pretty sure you're familiar with these two terms, organs and systems. Like an organ, you know, your heart, your liver, kidney. A system, respiratory system, digestive system, right? But the one that we're probably least familiar with is this term right in the middle. So how does it all fit in? This is how it would fit in, something like this. So in terms of your chemistry, you know, we learned about atoms and molecules, and DNA is just a really big molecule. And we know that molecules make up cells. All right. And here is an organ. Here is an organ system. And here is an individual, right? So here we have cells. Here we have organs. Here we have systems, and systems make up the individual. So in between cells and organs are these things called tissues. All right. So today we're going to talk about the different types of tissues. There's 4 of them. Now, what I did was I set up some questions for you that are kind of based for the most part on what we're going to go over today. It's right here. So intro to systems. So here are 7 questions that we're gonna, for the most part, spelled the word cuboidal incorrectly. That's embarrassing. Oh, just disappeared. So these questions are in regards to today's presentation, okay? So you can take a look at that in your course outline. Okay, so again, we're gonna talk about tissues, different types of tissues today. So these are the categories of tissues. So it seems that cells make up tissues. So tissues are made up of specialized cells. A certain type of specialized cell would make up these different types of tissues, right? So these are the 4. So epithelium would be made up of a certain set of specialized cells. A different set of specialized cells would make up connective tissue. A different set would make up muscle tissue. And a different set would make up nervous system tissue. Sorry, nervous tissue. So let's take a look at each one. So the first one is the epithelial tissue. So one of its main functions is to offer things like protection, and to line the surface of organs. So you can think of it as forming like barriers to prevent like leaking of material. We can think of epithelial tissue in 3 different types based on the shape of the cell, all right? So the epithelial tissue, which is tissue that, you know, covers things, covers organs and lines them and protects them. These are made up of cells that will look a little bit different from each other. So physically, they're going to look different, okay? And the 3 types are squamous, cuboidal, and columnar, okay? So the cuboidal ones will look like cubes. I should change that color. The columnar ones will look more like columns. And the squamous ones are going to look kind of fat, although you would not be able to tell that maybe the word squashed. If I think of the word squashed, you know, squashed. That's what they're going to kind of look like. So here are the three types. So here we have the squamous epithelial tissue. So these are going to be very thin and they're going to be very wide. And here's different places that we could find them. We can find them in the air sacs of your respiratory system. So when you learn about the respiratory system, you'll learn that, air comes in and then it starts to divide into tubes, and then it starts to divide into more tubes, and then it starts to form these little sacs called alveoli. The squamous epithelium would cover the air sacs, and you would see those cells would look something like this. They're called pneumocytes. So here would be an example. So you can see that it's very, very thin. It would almost be like you're looking at like a coin on its side, right? So these cells, if you were to look at it from the side, would be flat and very thin. So they would look, probably rounded if you were to look at the top down. So for instance, here is a cheek cell. You can see that top down, they look circular. You can see the nucleus, by the way. But if we were to look at the side of that cheek cell, it would look like very flat and thin, like a coin would. So these types of cells are found in your respiratory system. They're found in your skin. They're found in your blood vessels, your esophagus, your mouth. Also, that's where your cheek is, right? So those are one type of epithelial tissue called squamous. So these are thin and very wide cells. The next type are cuboidal. So if you were to actually, I know that sometimes the resolution of these cells is a little bit hard to see, but these cells that you're seeing on this image, now it's very hard to see, but here's one. So they would actually have a cube-like structure, and they would be strung together to make something like this, which looks circular. But every cell in here would have kind of like cube-like structure, which is very, very difficult to see from this image. Here I can kind of make out one, although not too clear. Here maybe I can start making out a little bit more of these cells, but again, the resolution isn't very, very, very great. So where do we find these cells? Well, we find them in things like your kidney. We can find them in glands. Glands are things that release chemicals, like salivary glands, for example. In your ovaries, right? This is what release eggs, once a month. So cuboidal epithelium is obviously based on its physical structure, which looks like a cube. Its main function is to secrete, which means, again, to release, or, which is the opposite, absorption, okay? Which is different than the squamous, which are generally used for some sort of like a protective barrier. And the reason why they're thin in the air sacs is actually to allow gases to diffuse through them. You'll learn more about that when you get into the respiratory system. So these types of epithelial tissue, the squamous ones, have a different function. They're used to line the surface of things, whereas the cuboidal ones are used for moving chemicals, either secreting them or absorbing them. The third type, you can see actually some more examples here of the cuboidal ones. Again, the resolution isn't the best, but you can kind of make out their structure in these images. So this is actually cross section of skin. You can see the sweat gland ducts. Remember, sweat glands secrete sweat. That's why they call it sweat glands. And they would be made up of cuboidal epithelium because one of the functions of cuboidal epithelium is to secrete or release things. In that case, it would be sweat. In the digestive system, their job is actually to absorb. Okay. The third type is columnar epithelium. So these are things like that would look something like this. So they're made up of cells. Again, the resolution is not the best, but if you were to zoom in, these cells would be kind of like this sort of a shape, like columns. So this is what they would look like. You can kind of make it out. Although maybe it's a little bit difficult to see the actual shape here. So where do we find them? We can find them in your digestive tract. So actually, correction, it's the columnar cells that are actually involved in absorption of nutrients, not cuboidal. I said digestive system as an example of absorption for cuboidal. It would actually be columnar cells, right? My apologies there. And again, that's just because physically they have a different shape. They look like columns. So you can see they're found in things like your digestive tract, your gallbladder. Gallbladder releases a chemical called bile. Bile helps break up fat. You'll learn probably a little bit more about that in your digestive system. So kind of sounds like the columnar cells have a very similar function to the cuboidal, because in the digestive tract, they absorb nutrients. So we can see that there is absorption and secretion also going on here. So how you distinguish between the two would be by their shape. Now you can see that they physically look different compared to the cuboidal cells. So these are epithelial examples. So epithelium tissue covers things. You can see they're involved in protection, but they're also involved in secreting substances and absorbing substances. The next type of tissue, we can kind of skip over this. There's just more examples of columnar epithelial. All right. Very actually quite nice to look at. The next type of tissue is connective tissue. All right. And this is also involved in protection. And it's also involved in supporting the organism in general. And you'll see what I mean by that when we start talking about some of the different types of connective tissue, which are, these are the four right here. So adipose is basically fat storing tissue. And then cartilage and bone is part of your skeleton. So that would be for structure and support and protection, right? You could say that, you know, your skeleton not only gives you structure and support, but it also protects your internal organs. And then your blood, which is, its role is to support, to provide like nutrients and oxygen. But it also has a role in protection too, because if you remember the image of a blood vessel, that there was also white blood cells in there, and white blood cells are part of your immune system. So let's take a look at some of these types of connective tissue. So here's adipose tissue. Again, its function is to store fat or lipids, all right? So they have a clear appearance. So they're actually very easy to identify because you can see right through them. See here, just two different examples of that. Here is cartilage. So cartilage is kind of like bone, but it's much softer than bone. Don't worry about the different types of cartilage, but here are just two different types. You can see they're just found different locations. So cartilage and bone actually work together often. So here's one type of cartilage. This is called hyaline cartilage. This is elastic cartilage. So if you go back to the difference, hyaline cartilage is actually on the ends of bones. So what happens as you get older, often that cartilage actually, I guess you could say it disappears or wears away. So if you have bone and bone, there would be some cartilage in between that acts to, kind of like protect the joints. When the cartilage wears away, what happens is you have bone on bone. So now what happens is you get lots of pain because there's no more cartilage, that acts like kind of like I don't want to say lubricant, but like a protection between the bones. So cartilage and bone actually work together. Here are just some examples of cartilage. Bone is much harder though. So bone is actually in what's called a matrix, or a chemical which is very, very solid, made of something called calcium carbonate, which is, it's important. It's why you need, one of the reasons why you need calcium is to build bone, because that's actually one of the ingredients is calcium carbonate, which you need to make to build bone. So here are some images of bone. You can see they're very easy to identify. They have a very, very particular shape or structure. So they're actually quite easy to visually see. So that's another type of connective, connective tissue. So adipose and cartilage and bone. And the last one is vascular tissue. So this is basically your blood, right? And your blood is mostly water, but it has a lot of other good things in there, like proteins, dissolved. So electrolytes would be like dissolved solutes, like things like sodium, chloride, potassium. We find hormones in your blood. We find oxygen, and we find things like sugars, like glucose, for example, in your blood. So it contains a lot of very, very valuable things. It also contains waste products too, that your body is going to use your blood to get rid of. So your blood's like a highway. It's transporting things. It's transporting good things to cells, but it's also allowing the cells to get rid of waste. And again, you'll probably learn a bit more about that when you do the circulatory system. In your blood, you do find cells. There are many types of cells, but the three main ones that we'll look at are erythrocytes, leukocytes, and platelets. So we actually already saw these. The erythrocytes are the red blood cells, the round ones that are very flat in appearance. The leukocytes, we call them the white blood cells. They're involved in immunity. And the platelets, if you remember, those are the ones that have a very, very unusual shape, because their role is to help in blood clotting. So you want them to stick together. That's why they're not round. So here is an example of some slides with blood. So, here's your red blood cells, the round ones. Here's a leukocyte, type of white blood cell. Hence the term leukemia would be a cancer where you're producing too many white blood cells. So here are your platelets. You can see in here, you can see the three different types of cells in your blood. So if you look at these images of skin, you can see the different types of tissues that we've looked at so far. You can see, for example, there is some connective tissue here. We can see that there's some adipose tissue here. We can see that there's a blood vessel. So obviously there will be blood, a part of your connective tissue again. Again, here is, fat cells. Again, here's an artery. So in there will be blood. Now, muscle. So the third type of tissue that we would see when we're looking at organs. So skin is actually an organ. It's actually the largest organ of your body. The largest internal organ is your liver, but the largest organ of your body is the skin. And underneath, you would actually find muscle. So that's actually our third type of tissue, muscle tissue. Now, what do muscle tissues do? Well, they allow for movement, okay? Because what they do is they contract. So a muscle cell contracts and gets shorter. That's what it does. So like the opposite of an elastic band. You know, elastic band you pull apart. A muscle, when it generates movement, actually contracts in length, and then it relaxes. So contraction and relaxing. Now, there's three types of muscle cell. There's skeletal, there's smooth muscle, and there's cardiac. They're actually quite easy to identify. The cardiac and the skeletal might actually be a little bit hard to distinguish one from the other. The smooth muscle is the most different. So the difference between skeletal and cardiac is skeletal is voluntary. So what that means is that you have control over this type of muscle fiber. So if you think about your arm, you have control over moving it, right? So that means that the muscles that are moving your arm would be skeletal muscle. If you think about your digestive system, you know, when your stomach is moving and moving the food in it, you have no control over that. So these two types of muscles are involuntary. You don't have control over smooth muscle or cardiac muscle. So here are some images. So here's skeletal muscle. So you'll notice that it has these banding patterns. We often say that skeletal muscle is striated. So that's what this means. So these lines that you see are called striations. So if you see that, it's skeletal muscle. Whereas smooth muscle, you don't really see that. You don't see those lines. So they're very easy to distinguish one from the other. If I look at cardiac muscle, I don't see the striation. So if you get a good image, you should be able to easily tell the difference between cardiac muscle and skeletal muscle, although sometimes it is a little bit hard depending on the resolution of your image. But it's kind of like skeletal muscle in that it's made up of like long fibers, although I don't know if you can tell from this image, but you don't see those striations, you don't see these lines. So if your image is clear, you should be able to easily tell the difference between cardiac muscle and skeletal muscle. Again, all three of those are tissues that are involved in movement. Cardiac muscle obviously is muscle found in your heart. So it has a very specific job. It's moving your heart. The reason why it wants to move your heart is so that when it contracts, it's moving blood, right? So the movement of your heart is actually like a pump. It's actually acting as a pump to move blood around your body. So that's the third type of tissue, okay? The fourth type of tissue is nerve tissue. Now, this has many roles. One role is to control muscle. So if you think about, again, going back to the example of skeletal muscle that you have control over, you have to command the movement of your arm. So that would be your nerve tissue or your nervous system talking to your muscles to generate the movement. So nerve tissue is involved in controlling muscles, but it also has many roles, many other roles too. you know, that's involved in thinking, for example, because brain cells are part of your nerve tissue. It's involved in releasing certain chemicals. Like, for example, it is involved in releasing things like chemicals that allow you to control the amount of water in your body, chemicals that actually control important reproductive hormones in your body. So nerve tissue actually has many roles. We know, if you remember, they have a really unusual appearance. So normally they'll have like a cell body with lots of extensions and a long tail with lots of extensions. It's kind of hard to see that here, but you can kind of see the extensions. I can see extensions. So the reason why is because the nerve cells, specialized cells make up the tissue, right? So nerve tissue is made up of specialized nerve cells. Those cells, the reason why they have these long branches is so that they can hook up to each other and communicate. Okay, form and function, right? So if I look at an example of an organ, then, you know, if we end here, what I should see is that an organ should contain all of those 4 tissue types. So something like the stomach should have, make this a little bit smaller so you can see it. It should have epithelial tissue. You can see that here. Sorry. Okay, okay, you can see that here. It should have connective tissue. So you could see that here. We didn't talk about loose connective. There's a whole bunch of other ones, so we didn't go into all of them. But there's our connective tissue. It's made up of smooth muscle, because the stomach does generate movement, and nerve tissue that can control that movement. So those are examples of an organ where you see the 4 types of the different tissues working together to make an organ work. Okay, so that was just an introduction into the different types of tissues. You know, going back to the beginning, we looked at way back to the beginning. Okay, these are the 4 types, and then we ended with an example of an organ that actually has, you know, all 4 types in it. Okay, so let's keep it short today. Let's end here. Next time we will introduce systems. I'll talk to Slippets about, you know, what system we're gonna begin with. Actually, let me stop recording now. Okay.